Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to talk about the topic of coronary artery disease. So let me firstly start by giving you an outline for this video. We're going to start off by defining what is coronary artery disease and what actually happens in coronary artery disease. We're then going to talk about what coronary artery disease can lead to. So we'll start off with stable angina. Then what we'll talk about is the acute coronary syndrome, so unstable angina and myocardial infarction. We'll talk then about what actually is going to happen in both stable angina, why it causes that pain upon exertion, and we'll also talk about what will happen in myocardial infarction and what actually leads the cells to die and the process that actually occurs and the histopathology of it all. We'll also look at the two different severities of myocardial infarction, so subendocardial myocardial infarction versus transmural myocardial infarction, and we'll talk about why they have such different ECG appearances, i.e. the N-STEMI, non-ST elevation myocardial infarction in the case of the subendothelial myocardial infarction, and the STEMI, the ST elevation myocardial infarction in the case of a transmural myocardial infarction. Then what we'll talk about finally is drug treatment of everything. So the drug treatment of angina, stable angina, in order to prevent it leading to a heart attack, or at least in order to try and prevent heart attack, acute coronary syndromes. And also the drug treatments, and not just drug treatment, also surgical treatments that we can do if someone has actually had a heart attack to try and revascularize the heart. Okay, so we will go through the pathology first and then we'll look at drug treatment right at the end. So I will go through all of the different complications then of coronary artery disease before I actually start talking about the treatments. I think that's the best way of doing it, because otherwise if you start, for instance, talking about stable angina and you talk about all the drug treatments for stable angina, well, most of the drug treatments are trying to prevent myocardial infarction, heart attack. So we need to understand what actually happens in a heart attack and why heart attacks happen in order to understand the drugs that prevent them. So that's why we'll leave all of the drug treatment and other forms of treatment, more invasive forms of treatment, right till the end and discuss that all as one. Okay, so let's begin then with the definition of coronary artery disease. So coronary artery disease is often abbreviated down to CAD for short, so C for coronary, A for artery, and D for disease. And there's a number of other names that you'll often hear which refer to the exact same thing. So ischemic heart disease is also, it means the same thing, and also coronary heart disease. These all mean the same thing, and they have abbreviations as well. So IHD stands for ischemic heart disease, and there's also coronary heart disease, which is abbreviated down to CHD. These all mean exactly the same thing. So what actually then is coronary artery disease, or if you like, ischemic heart disease or coronary heart disease? What are these things? Well, here's the definition then. The definition is that it is the stenosis of the coronary arteries due to atherosclerosis occurring within the coronary arteries. Okay, so stenosis is a key word, so I'll write this down. So stenosis is the fancy word for the narrowing. So stenosis of the coronary arteries just means narrowing of the coronary arteries due to atherosclerosis. And the first thing that I want to do in this video is start by reminding you of the structure of an atherosclerotic plaque. We're not going to go through the full pathogenesis of atherosclerosis. I have a video on atherosclerosis which is in the playlist on the cardiovascular system if you'd like to watch that video. But I'm just going to revise the structure of an atherosclerotic plaque just so that we've got it fresh in our minds. And I also want to talk about the anatomy of the coronary arteries. So we'll have a look at a picture of the heart and we'll look at the major coronary arteries so that we have firmly in our head what coronary artery disease actually is, and then we'll move on to the complications, which are of course the really clinically important bits. Okay, so stenosis of coronary arteries due to atherosclerosis. So for the first part of this video then, we're just going to try and understand the two key concepts here, the coronary arteries and atherosclerosis. So we'll start by talking about atherosclerosis, and we'll have a look at the structure of an atherosclerotic plaque in an arbitrary blood vessel, and then what we'll look at specifically is the coronary arteries of the heart. Okay, so an atherosclerotic plaque then. So what I want to do is draw an atherosclerotic plaque then in the wall of a blood vessel. So I'm going to draw an entire blood vessel, and we're going to have taken a cross-section through the blood vessel, and we're going to be able to see the different parts of the atherosclerotic plaque. So atherosclerosis then, this is a disease of blood vessels where they get large masses building up in the blood vessel wall, and these masses are non-cancerous and they're known as atherosclerotic plaques. So I'm going to draw one of these atherosclerotic plaques, and we're going to see the two principal components of it now. So I'll start by drawing the outermost portion of the blood vessel wall, okay, which is the tunica adventitia. So I'm going to start on the outside and work inwards, okay, like so. So here is the tunica adventitia then, and tunica of course just means layer, and the adventitia layer is an outer layer of connective tissue. So all of this layer that I'm now drawing on, this is going to be the tunica adventitia. And the atherosclerotic plaques, they're not a disease of the tunica adventitia, so we will see the atherosclerotic plaque as we loom inwards, but this is the most outer portion of the blood vessel, known as the tunica adventitia. And we'll imagine that we are talking about an atherosclerotic plaque in an artery. So we'll be drawing an artery here. So I'll just colour in the tunica adventitia, so we'll have it coloured in here in orange. And as I say, it's that layer of connective tissue that really just connects the blood vessel to the surrounding portions of the body, the surrounding body tissues. Okay, then inside of the tunica adventitia, now just make sure this is nice and straight here. Inside the tunica adventitia, we're going to have another layer of connective tissue, a thin layer of connective tissue known as the external elastic lamina, and this is going to demarcate the beginning of the smooth muscle cell layer of the blood vessel wall. So I'll just colour this in now in blue here. So it's just a thin layer of elastic connective tissue known as the external elastic lamina, and we're going to have another elastic lamina which will be the internal elastic lamina in a moment. Okay, but this one at the moment, this is the external elastic lamina, so this is the external elastic lamina. Okay, and the external elastic lamina, as I say, is going to split the tunica adventitia from the layer that's now internal of that, which is the tunica media, which is made up of smooth muscle cells. Now before I draw the tunica media, I'm going to put the internal elastic lamina on, because the tunica media is bounded peripherally by the external elastic lamina and internally or viscerally by the internal elastic lamina. So I'm going to put the internal elastic lamina on. It will just make it easier for me to draw the tunica media then, because the tunica media is just all of the portion that's in between those two elastic laminas. Okay, right, so all of this layer now here is going to be vascular smooth muscle cells and elastic connective tissue. So remember, depending on which artery you're actually talking about, the balance between vascular smooth muscle cells and elastic connective tissue will differ. So if you're talking about a very elastic artery like the aorta, you'll have a lot of elastic connective tissue and not so many vascular smooth muscle cells, whereas if you're talking about a major muscular artery like the carotid arteries, you'll have a huge number of vascular smooth muscle cells. So here in red, these are supposed to represent the vascular smooth muscle cells. And the atherosclerotic plaque that I'm going to draw in this blood vessel wall, it's not actually going to affect the tunica media. So the tunica media participates in the formation of the atherosclerotic plaque, but as of yet, I have not drawn anything abnormal in this blood vessel wall structure. All of this is perfectly normal. Okay, so this layer from the external elastic lamina to the internal elastic lamina, this is all tunica media, and as I say, this will be made up of vascular smooth muscle cells and elastic connective tissue, and the balance between those two will depend on which artery we're actually talking about here. Okay, then we've got this internal elastic lamina also shown in blue here. Okay, and again, this is a thin layer of elastic connective tissue, and it demarcates the end of the tunica media. So this is the internal elastic lamina, again in blue here. Okay, oh, and by the way, of course, the vascular smooth muscle cells will go all the way around. I'm just too lazy to draw that, so I'll just put a little bit of red colouring in here. Okay, and of course, these vascular smooth muscle cells, they control the diameter of the lumen of the blood vessel because they form rings of smooth muscle cells all the way around the artery structure. You can imagine then that if all of those were to contract down, they'd all shorten their length. And if you've got rings of them, then if they all shorten their length, the circumference of those rings is going to decrease, and when the circumference of a ring decreases, the diameter of that ring decreases, so it's going to cause vasoconstriction. Okay, so we're working on our blood vessel wall structure from outwards to inwards. So we've had the tunica adventitia, external elastic lamina, tunica media, internal elastic lamina, and now inside of the internal elastic lamina, you've then got a portion of connective tissue known as the subendothelial connective tissue, and then the basement membrane with the endothelial cells on, which are actually going to line the lumen of the blood vessel. And it's in the subendothelial space that you're going to have the huge atherosclerotic plaque now formed. So I'm going to draw the abnormality now. So here is the normal endothelium on this side, and now it's going to bulge out into the blood vessel lumen here, and this is going to be my atherosclerotic plaque. So this is the abnormality here. Okay? Right, so this line, this can represent my basement membrane on which the endothelial cells will be sitting here. So I'll colour this in green, like so. So this is the basement membrane. So remember, whenever you have an epithelium, whether it's endothelium or elsewhere in the body, the epithelial cells are always going to be sitting on the basement membrane. This is what they connect to. This is in effect why these endothelial cells are not going to get washed away by the blood. Okay, so here we have the endothelial cells, like so, and these ones here are over the atherosclerotic plaque, like so, and I'll just give them a few nuclei to make them look like cells. Right, so there we have our endothelium, and obviously you can see that it's protruding out into the lumen of the blood vessel. And this space in between the basement membrane and the internal elastic lamina, this is a space containing connective tissue, and this is known as the subendothelial connective tissue, or more informally just as the subendothelial space. Okay, and it's this subendothelial space that is diseased in atherosclerosis. This is where the mass of the atherosclerotic plaque has built up, and I'm about to draw it in here. And one more piece of terminology concerning blood vessel walls. There is the concept of the tunica intima, which is all of the layers from the endothelial cells, the basement membrane, the subendothelial space, and the internal elastic lamina. All of those layers together, they are known as the tunica intima. So we often say that atherosclerosis is a disease of the tunica intima because, of course, it is occurring within the tunica intima. It's occurring specifically in the subendothelial space of the tunica intima, but the endothelial cells are hugely involved in the formation of this atherosclerotic plaque in that subendothelial space. So we can think of it as a disease of the entire tunica intima. Okay, so at the moment we've just got a white blob where the atherosclerotic plaque actually is. Now what I want to do is draw in detail what that's going to actually look like. So remember, there are two major components to an atherosclerotic plaque. So I'll write this down here. So this is going to be called an atherosclerotic plaque, and the two major parts of the atherosclerotic plaque are one, the lipid core. Okay, so number one is the lipid core, and this is where we're going to have a huge number of foam cells which are made from macrophages and vascular smooth muscle cells that have taken up oxidized LDL particles and have ended up utterly filled up with cholesterol molecules. And they end up so full with cholesterol molecules that they change in their histological appearance, and they change in their behaviour hugely, and they are now known as foam cells. So I'll draw one here. So a great big blob of a cell histologically. So this is going to be a foam cell, and the reason it's called a foam cell is that if you actually look at it, it looks foamy down the microscope, and the reason is that its cytoplasm is just absolutely full up of special droplets which are storing cholesterol molecules. So I'll colour these in yellow, and they're full of cholesterol molecules. And in the fixation process to produce histological slides that you can look down in the microscope, lipid molecules get washed away in that process. So these end up showing up as white on the microscope slide. So it gives the cell the foamy sort of appearance of having bubbles inside it. Okay, so in the lipid core you have a huge number of these foam cells, which are, as I say, macrophages from the bloodstream and vascular smooth muscle cells from the tunica media, which have come into the subendothelial space, taken up loads of oxidized LDL particles which have come from the blood. Well, LDL comes from the blood and then is converted to oxidized LDL by the macrophages, which are going to become foam cells, which come in and start releasing horrible molecules such as superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, which then convert the LDL particles to oxidized LDL particles. Okay, and they to store all of this cholesterol up in these special droplets inside the cytoplasm, and their properties change so much that they're now referred to collectively as foam cells. And in the lipid core of the atherosclerotic plaque, that's the main thing. You've got loads and loads of foam cells that have accumulated over decades, potentially. You also have pools of extracellular cholesterol, because foam cells aren't particularly stable. They have a tendency to die, and when they die they release all of the cholesterol that they've got stored into the extracellular space, and it just ends up pooling. So what you're going to have in the bottom portion of the atherosclerotic plaque then is loads and loads of foam cells, and this is a bit out of proportion, but you'd have absolutely tons of these things in reality. So these are all foam cells then, forming the lipid core of the atherosclerotic plaque. You'd also have extracellular cholesterol deposits. Let's say all of this here, this is extracellular cholesterol deposits all over the place. And that's what's known as the lipid core of the atherosclerotic plaque. Okay, so as I say, that's formed because LDL particles have come into the subendothelial space because the endothelial cells have been dysfunctioning. And as I say, if you're not familiar with the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis, do go away and watch the video on atherosclerosis, but I feel bad for not explaining this properly, so I will just give a brief account of what happens in atherosclerosis. So excuse me for a moment if you're very familiar with this. So, in atherosclerosis, what happens is you get a chronic injury to endothelial cells. So there's something that is chronically injuring endothelial cells in the blood vessel that's going to develop the atherosclerotic plaque. So it's these endothelial cells over where we have this atherosclerotic plaque now that will be chronically injured in the pathogenesis process. Okay, so for a long, long time they will be being injured by something. And things that could be injuring them are too high blood pressure, the toxins of cigarette smoke if you're smoking all the time and breathing in foul chemicals into your blood, high blood sugar if you've got poorly controlled diabetes mellitus, and what other things could be doing it? Let me just think. Oh, sheer stress as well. So atherosclerotic plaques generally develop over the branch points where arteries are coming off other arteries, and those endothelial cells at those branch points, the flow's disturbed there where the blood's having to suddenly divert off into a different direction, and that is believed to put pressure on the endothelial cells that damages them chronically. So chronic damage to endothelial cells causes them to dysfunction, and they start recruiting into the subendothelial space inflammatory cells, so macrophages and also T cells. So they're effectively initiating an inflammatory response in the subendothelial space because of the chronic damage. They also increase their permeability, so they produce gaps in between the endothelial cells. Again, another big part of the inflammatory response, because usually you want to build an inflammatory exudate so that all the proteins that are in the blood that are fantastic at attacking bacteria and the like can get into the extracellular space and actually have access to the pathogen. So they increase permeability, and then LDL comes into the subendothelial space as well. Then what happens is the macrophages, they start releasing all sorts of horrible molecules, so reactive oxygen species, superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, and this is again part of their attack. They think they've come into the subendothelial space because there is some horrible pathogen in there. In reality, there's nothing in there. At least we don't think there's anything in there. There is research into whether there might be something actually in there that's causing it, but at the moment it's not widely believed that there is. But the macrophages come in and they release these horrible molecules which then alter the LDL that's come in and turn it into this oxidized LDL. And we don't really know what the nature of oxidized LDL is. It's just the name for LDL particles that have been exposed to these horrible molecules that macrophages have released, and they've been changed in some way by these molecules reacting with the molecules in an LDL particle. Then what happens is the macrophages take up the LDL particles because they don't like them, and they end up with massive stores of cholesterol in them, and that's when they convert into foam cells. So over years and years and years of this happening, you get more and more foam cells building up in the subendothelial space until it actually forms a noticeable disturbance, and that's when we start to call this an atherosclerotic plaque. Concurrently with this, you form the other part of the atherosclerotic plaque, which is the fibrous cap. So now onto the second portion of the atherosclerotic plaque, the fibrous cap. And we will have the fibrous cap represented in orange, I think is probably going to be the best colour I can go with. The fibrous cap then, this is a cap over the top of the lipid core, protecting it, strengthening it, and this is very important for providing a bit of stability to this horrible structure. Okay, it protects and makes it a solid structure, whereas obviously the lipid core is just goo. It's not very solid or stable at all. So having a fibrous cap over the top of this is a good thing. It's far better to have a nice thick fibrous cap over the lipid core, as we'll see later, than having a very thin fibrous cap over the lipid core. Okay, so what actually happens then to form the fibrous cap? Well, you remember me telling you that when the endothelial cells dysfunction, they bring in T cells as well as just macrophages. The T cells and the macrophages that come into the subendothelial space, and remember they'll be coming in over a long period of time, continuously, chronically. They're coming in and releasing lots of cytokine molecules. And a cytokine, I'll just write that keyword down. A cytokine, people are often confused with what a cytokine is. A cytokine just means any molecule that's released by a cell of the immune system and which goes and acts on another cell in the body and changes its behaviour in some way. That is all. Okay, so it's a signalling molecule, but the special thing that it has is that it was released by an immune cell. So it's just a signalling molecule released by an immune cell that changes the behaviour of another cell. Very, very simple. So these macrophages and T cells are going to release all sorts of cytokines, which are going to change the behaviour of surrounding cells. Okay, you can go away if you like and learn the names of all the specific cytokines that they actually release. I would advise you not to bother. It doesn't actually aid your understanding of this at all. So what happens then is the T cells and the macrophages come in, release loads of cytokines which are going to affect the behaviour of cells in the vicinity of where they have arrived, which is the subendothelial space. And indeed they go down into the tunica media, these cytokines, and they affect the behaviour of the vascular smooth muscle cells here. And what happens is the vascular smooth muscle cells start behaving very oddly. They start moving, which they certainly shouldn't do. Okay, cells are not usually motile, so they start moving into the subendothelial space. And then once they get into the subendothelial space, the source of the cytokines, so they migrate towards where the cytokines are being released. Once they get into the subendothelial space, and of course they're arriving in the midst of this atherosclerotic plaque development here, they then start proliferating, because some of these cytokines have pro-proliferative effects. So they start dividing, and they produce loads of smooth muscle cells in the subendothelial space, and these smooth muscle cells can either end up taking up oxidized LDL just like the macrophages and become foam cells, or they can end up migrating to just underneath the basement membrane here, okay, and changing their properties completely, becoming fibroblast-like, so they take on fibroblast-like behaviour, and of course fibroblasts are those cells which have the job of creating connective tissue. They're in connective tissue regions. So indeed the subendothelial space would have contained fibroblasts already, just very few compared to how many it's now going to contain. So we get these vascular smooth muscle cells coming in to this sort of region here, taking on fibroblast-like behaviour and starting to churn out connective tissue, collagen and molecules like that, and they form a very thick layer of connective tissue over the lipid core, which is called the fibrous cap. So here is the fibrous cap. And it, as I say, will consist of these vascular smooth muscle cells that now have fibroblast-like behaviour, a huge amount of connective tissue that they've synthesized, and you'll also have in there a few of these trapped T lymphocytes which called for the vascular smooth muscle cells to create this structure. Okay, so there is a revision then of atherosclerosis. Those are the two components, the key components to remember about atherosclerosis. You have the fibrous cap over the top, protecting the lipid core, which is the goo underneath, consisting of foam cells. Okay, so that's the process of atherosclerosis, and risk factors for this are anything that could cause chronic damage to the endothelial cells, such as hypertension, uncontrolled diabetes, smoking, and also having too high plasma LDL level. If you have very high plasma LDL level, too high cholesterol in your blood, then obviously more cholesterol particles will be coming into the subendothelial space when the endothelial cells dysfunction in this way, and therefore the process will just occur quicker. So you'll get far quicker atherosclerosis occurring if you have got too high blood LDL concentration. So that's another really important risk factor. Okay, right. So that's the atherosclerosis part, the reminder of that portion. Now what we want to talk about is coronary arteries, because remember, coronary artery disease, the topic of this video, is atherosclerosis occurring in the coronary arteries. So let's now have a look at the coronary arteries, and then we'll have got the two components of this, and then we can move on to the actual complications of this. So, anatomy then. So I'm going to start off by drawing a picture of the heart, and then we will mark on some of our coronary arteries on this. And of course, I'm not going to tell you the names of every coronary artery that has a name. I'm just going to do the big main ones that you should know about. Okay, so how am I going to draw the heart then? So I usually draw pictures of the heart by starting by drawing the right ventricle, and then I add everything on from there. So here, this is the right ventricle with, of course, the pulmonary trunk coming out here. Then on top of it here, we will have the right atrium, and of course this big blood vessel draining into it will be then the superior vena cava. I'll also mark on here the inferior vena cava, which will be behind here, and of course would also be feeding into the right atrium. So I'll just label things up here. So this is the right atrium, this is the superior vena cava, and this is the inferior vena cava down here. This is the right ventricle, but I don't just want to label it on there because I'm going to draw coronary arteries over the top there. So I have the label here. And now let's put on the left side of the heart. So let's have the left ventricle here, like so, and then it will go round and become the left atrium. And I've forgotten to put on the pulmonary veins coming in here, so it'll have to just be messy like so. So here are the pulmonary veins, and then I'll put sort of the division between the left ventricle and the left atrium there. So this up here, that's the left atrium, of course. These are two of the pulmonary veins, the two left pulmonary veins here. I'm not going to try and mark on the two right pulmonary veins, but of course they'd be behind here draining into the left atrium. And then we'll have the left ventricle out the front here. And the one last thing to put on is the aorta, which will come out at this sort of position. So remember, the left ventricle sort of goes behind the right ventricle, and therefore the aorta is going to bulge out like so. So here's the arch of the aorta, and now I can mark on the pulmonary trunk splitting into the two pulmonary arteries. Okay, so here's my sort of picture of this, and I need to sort of put a division like there. Okay, so is there anything else that I want to mark on there? I think I'll just put a little bit of colour on it. Or do I want to put colour on it? I'll just put a little bit of colour on to make it look a little bit more interesting. So we'll have all of these underlined in pink. And now let's mark on this picture then the coronary arteries. So you have two coronary arteries, two main ones of course, the starting ones, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery, and these come straight off the aorta, so they are the first branches of the aorta. So of course, often we think of the first branches of the aorta as being coming off the aortic arch here, so you'll have the brachiocephalic artery here, which will split into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Then you'll have the left common carotid artery and then the left subclavian artery, like so. But in fact, the first branches that come off the aorta are the coronary arteries, and they come off right down here. So you'll have the right coronary artery coming off in this sort of position, and then moving on the surface of the heart down here, and I'll mark it on in just a moment. And you'll also have the left coronary artery coming off behind the pulmonary trunk here, so I'll just label this up. This is the pulmonary trunk, so of course the right ventricle will push blood into here, and then the pulmonary trunk splits off into the two pulmonary arteries, and they take the deoxygenated blood to the two lungs. So you'll have a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery, which has disappeared behind the ascending aorta here. Okay, so this is the pulmonary trunk that I've got shown there. So behind the pulmonary trunk there is the left coronary artery coming off, and this will appear down here, and we'll only see a little bit of it before it splits into two other branches. Okay, so let me now mark this actually on. So we'll start with the right coronary artery. So the right coronary artery, as I say, it comes off the aorta here, and then it runs down in this gap between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So it's got a very nice position as far as remembering it is concerned. It's in between the right atrium and the right ventricle here. Now the first portion of it isn't really visible. It's within the heart muscle, and then it becomes visible. So this bit here that I've drawn on, that wouldn't really be visible. It only becomes visible at this sort of portion where it's actually come out of the heart muscle and it's lying on the top of the heart, and if you were looking at a human heart you would be able to see it on the surface there. Okay, so let me just label this up then. So this is one of the things that we are drawing this picture to actually see. So this is the right coronary artery, so the RCA for short, but I should just write out its name in full because after all this is what we're studying. So this is the right coronary artery here. Okay, now this is the part where the initial line that I gave you about how we're just going to learn the name branches comes in. So the right coronary artery has lots of branches. We're not going to learn the names of all of them. Okay, so you'll have lots of little branches of the right coronary artery coming off it here and feeding the right ventricle here. We're not going to learn the names of those. We're going to learn the name of this major branch here, okay, which I'm now colouring in. So this sort of comes off the right coronary artery and then makes its way down the margin of the right ventricle here, okay, the anterior margin, if you like, of the right ventricle, and for this reason it's known as the right marginal artery. So this one is called the right marginal artery. So this is a major branch of the right coronary artery that you should know the name of, the right marginal artery. Okay, and the right coronary artery does continue on. It's going to be on the back of the heart, or the underside of the heart if you like, but we won't draw that on this picture. We'll draw another picture in order to show the underside of the heart and where the right coronary artery continues on to. So don't worry, we will come to that, but not yet. Okay, so now let's do the left coronary artery. So again, like I said, I've drawn the right coronary artery even at bits where it wouldn't be visible, so I'm actually going to colour that in a different colour. So I have it in green. So this portion that I'm over highlighting now in green, this is the portion of the right coronary artery that wouldn't actually be visible. You wouldn't be able to see that on the surface. That's sort of buried within the muscle, and then it becomes visible here. The portion that I'm about to show of the left coronary artery is the same story. I'm going to show it just so that you understand, but it wouldn't actually be visible. So here it is. It would not only be behind the pulmonary trunk, but it would also be within the muscle, and it becomes visible only at this sort of point here. So all of this bit here in green, that wouldn't actually be visible, but that's the path it's sort of following. And now it's going to split very quickly into two branches here. One that will come down the front in the interventricular sulcus here between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and another that will go sideways, if you like, between the left atrium and the left ventricle there. Okay, so what are the names of these two extremely important branches? And you'll have heard of these before, I guarantee you. Well, first let me just label up the left coronary artery. So left coronary artery, of course, that can be abbreviated down to LCA here. Okay. Now, what are these two branches that the left coronary artery is split into? There is the left anterior descending artery, often just abbreviated as the LAD, but again I'll write this out in full. So this is the left, obviously because it's the branch of the left coronary artery. Anterior because it's on the anterior surface of the heart. This is the anterior surface of the heart, whereas the underside of the heart is known as the posterior surface of the heart. Descending because it's descending down the heart to the apex of the heart. And then of course artery because it's an artery. So this is the left anterior descending artery, and it's not abbreviated to LADA, it's just abbreviated to the LAD, so be aware of that. Okay, the left anterior descending artery, you'll hear the abbreviation LAD all the time. Okay, right. Now the other branch of the left coronary artery then, this branch here, this is known as the left circumflex artery, and for short this is abbreviated down to the LCX. Okay, so this is for left circumflex artery. Also note the lack of the A at the end, so it's not LCXA, it's just LCX, so the left circumflex artery. Okay, right, and of course, you know, the left anterior descending artery, this will have lots of branches coming off it as well. I'm actually going to tell you about one of the branches coming off the left anterior descending artery in just a moment. So one major branch that I want you to know the name of, which comes off the left anterior descending artery, is the left diagonal artery. Okay, so this one here, this picture's rapidly getting too overcrowded. This is the left diagonal artery. So this is a branch of the left anterior descending artery, and it goes sort of sideways. It follows the same sort of course as the left circumflex artery, just much lower down here. So this is the left diagonal artery. Okay, right, so that's the view of the coronary arteries, the major coronary arteries, I'll stress, and their branches, from the anterior surface of the heart. What I now want to do is flip the heart over and continue this on. So I want to see, where does the circumflex artery go, what are the major branches of the circumflex artery, where does the right coronary artery end up, what's the final branch of the, well, first, some more major branches basically that are on the posterior surface is what I want to now show you. Okay, so let's do a drawing from the posterior surface. So once again, let me explain exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm now going to flip the heart over, and we're going to look from the underside now, and I'm going to have it so that this side here is the anterior side, and this side is the posterior side. So I'll draw the picture and then explain exactly what I've got here. Okay, so it's a substantially simpler picture than before. So here's the heart from the underside, and here, this should orient you. This is the inferior vena cava here, so I'll colour it in blue. After all, it is carrying deoxygenated blood. So this is the inferior vena cava that we're looking at down there. So we are now looking from this angle here, and specifically this is the front of your body, okay, and this is the back of your body. So your spine would be, and yeah, I've just realised you can't actually see me when I go down here. So your spine would be in this sort of direction. The front of your body, your chest wall, would be over here basically. So we're looking up from the diaphragm, if you like, and this is the front of your body, this is the back of your body. This is obviously the right of your body, I believe, and this will be the left of your body. Okay, right, so let's now have the right coronary artery following around down here. So we're following the right coronary artery now, and it's coming down. So this is the right atrium here, where the inferior vena cava is going into, and now I want to follow the right coronary artery. So here it comes, round like so, and here I'll mark on the right marginal artery, so we're just seeing this from a different angle. So I hope you understand where this is all coming from. Okay, so we've followed this around. This is on the margin here. Here's the margin viewed from this other picture, and now there's another major branch of the right coronary artery right at the end here, which is known as the right and posterior descending artery. Okay, and this is also going to move in the interventricular gaps. If you like, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle, and this is sort of the left atrial region, and now this is moving in the sulcus between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So it's just, if you like, equivalent to the left anterior descending artery here, but it's now on the posterior side of the heart. Okay, so this one here, and now I can cover up this horrible scribble. This is the right, because it's a branch of the right coronary artery. Okay, and it's posterior because it's on the posterior surface of the heart, and again it's going to be the descending artery because it's descending down from the top of the heart to the apex of the heart down here. Okay, so this is the right posterior descending artery. Okay, like so. And I'll just underline this now in a different colour because we're looking on a different side. Now let's follow the circumflex artery round and see what happens to that. So now of course we'll be going from the different side. Remember, if you like, this is the left atrium, this is the left ventricle here. So here now, and I'll just make sure this is straight, here is the left circumflex artery coming round in the gap between the left atrium and the left ventricle. I'll also add on the left diagonal artery coming round here because this is coming round this margin here as well. So here is the left diagonal artery, what's left of it here. And now there's going to be a branch coming off the left circumflex artery, which is going to come down here like so. And this is now known as the left marginal artery. So this one here is the left marginal artery. Okay, so you have a right marginal artery and a left marginal artery. And here is the left marginal artery. Okay, so that's the final major coronary artery that I want you to know about. Okay, so that's enough anatomy. So these are the coronary arteries of the heart, and these are taking oxygenated blood from the aorta, and they're going to be giving this oxygenated blood to the myocardial cells of the heart. And you might be asking, well, why on earth do the heart muscle cells need a blood supply? I mean, they've got a huge amount of blood inside the chambers, okay? And for instance, the left ventricle, that's got a huge great pool of oxygenated blood. Of course, it's a little bit more problematic for the right ventricle and the right atrium because they're full of deoxygenated blood. But even in the case of the left chambers, the left atrium and the left ventricle, where we have got a huge great pool of oxygenated blood inside, very little of the actual myocardial wall, very little of the thickness of that can actually get oxygen and nutrients from the blood inside it. Okay, so we do need a blood supply to the myocardial cells, and it's these arteries that are delivering blood straight from the aorta, nice oxygenated blood to the tissue of the myocardium. Now, in coronary artery disease, what's going to happen over decades and decades is you're going to get atherosclerotic plaques forming in one or potentially multiple of your coronary arteries, and this is going to lead to problems because these atherosclerotic plaques, they hugely damage blood flow through that area. And that's not good because the heart needs the blood supplied to it. So all of coronary artery disease, or indeed all of this video that we're going to do from now on, is going to be about understanding what are the effects of actually having atherosclerotic plaques within your coronary circulation. And we're going to see firstly stable angina, which is the result of actually having atherosclerotic plaques, the chronic result, if you like, of having these atherosclerotic plaques in your coronary artery. And throughout the video, I think we'll just go for the example of having an atherosclerotic plaque somewhere in your left anterior descending artery. So maybe you could imagine we've got an atherosclerotic plaque here, and it's narrowing blood flow there. So we're going to see firstly the chronic complication of that, and the chronic complication of that is that you get stable angina. Okay, then what can happen is you can get acute exacerbations. Okay, so there is something known as an acute coronary syndrome, and in acute coronary syndrome what happens is the atherosclerotic plaque ruptures, which means that the top of the atherosclerotic plaque gets teared off. Now, why is that such a bad thing? Well, this tends to activate the coagulation pathways within the blood. So coagulation, remember, is the process where the blood turns from being a liquid to being a solid. So coagulation is supposed to be activated when you've got a great big hole in the side of your blood vessel. It's supposed to be activated as part of the hemostatic response, the response to stop hemorrhage. Now, what is it about having a hole in the side of your blood vessel that causes coagulation? Well, it's the fact that lots of the components of the blood suddenly see molecules that they would never have been allowed to see before. Components of the blood such as platelets and coagulation factors, which form the solid massive a blood clot. They usually have a very boring life. They don't see many molecules. They only see other components of the blood and the endothelial cells. And the endothelial cells make sure that they never show the cell, the platelets and the coagulation factors, certain molecules, because these molecules are what activate the platelets and the coagulation factors to actually undergo coagulation, to activate and form a solid mass. And suddenly when you get this ruptured surface of the atherosclerotic plaque, all sorts of molecules that the platelets and the coagulation factors shouldn't be exposed to are suddenly exposed to them, and they activate the coagulation process. Okay, then what you get is a solid mass forming over the top of the atherosclerotic plaque, known as a thrombus. So when you form blood clots in the middle of perfectly healthy blood vessels, it's known as a thrombus, and the process is known as thrombosis. We'll go over this in more detail later on. And that can then occlude the blood vessel hugely more than the original atherosclerotic plaque and can completely occlude it and block blood flow through that blood vessel. Again, that's then going to lead to acute complications such as unstable angina in its least severe form. So if it hasn't completely occluded flow, if you're still getting quite a bit of flow through, enough flow to keep the cells alive, then you get unstable angina. If you've occluded enough flow that myocardiocytes are not going to be able to live with that delivery of oxygen, then you're going to get a heart attack where cells are actually going to start dying in your heart, a myocardial infarction. But as I say, we'll discuss this in much more detail in the next video. So we'll start with stable angina in the next video.